Today I want to introduce you to some of the research that we do in my lab. I just want to give you a broad overview of the importance of what we're doing and then spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the projects that my students are working on. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the students that are currently working in my lab as well as those who have already graduated. They are really the ones who do all of the work. They are incredible students and I'm so happy to have been able to work with them. Resistance is futile. But when we're talking about antibiotic resistance in bacteria, I think a better question is, says who? This is a story from a few years ago now. There was a patient in Nevada who was diagnosed with an infection that was resistant to every FDA-approved antibiotic in the United States. When I share this statistic with people, they always end up asking me, well, what do you do for that patient? What happened to that patient? And unfortunately, in a situation like this, there is nothing that can be done for the patient. And this patient did pass away from this drug-resistant infection. So resistance to antibiotics is not a futile strategy for bacteria. It's a very important strategy that they can use to persist and continue to cause infection in the host. What does antibiotic resistance look like in the US right now? Well, right now we are looking at over 3 million antibiotic resistant infections in patients every single year. They lead to nearly 50,000 deaths. And one of the really dangerous things about these drug-resistant bacteria is the fact that most of them actually hang out in the hospital. Most people don't go to the hospital because they have a drug-resistant infection. Most people go to the hospital for something else. Knee surgery, childbirth, some other type of illness. And they pick up one of these drug-resistant infections in the hospital. This is a really dangerous situation where a patient is already compromised because you're in the hospital, and now you've acquired an infection that antibiotics may not be able to treat. Worldwide, it's estimated that drug-resistant infections cause 700,000 deaths per year. Almost a third of those are coming from multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. It is estimated that if we don't do anything about this, if we can't come up with new drugs, new therapies, by 2030, the costs of losing a job, paying medical bills, losing a family member who supports the whole household could force an additional 24 million people worldwide into extreme poverty. And of course, the worst case scenario is here. By 2050, 10 million people a year could die from drug-resistant infections. That's more people than die of cancer worldwide every year. What we see when new drugs are introduced to the market is unfortunately a trend that doesn't look good for the future. What we start to see is that when drugs are introduced to the market, let's look right here. Methicillin was introduced to the market in 1960. Scientists identified methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, sometimes called MRSA, in 1960. Fluconazole is an antifungal drug to treat Candida infections. Candida is a very common cause of yeast infections, but in hospital settings can also cause bloodstream infections. Fluconazole was FDA approved in 1990. Fluconazole-resistant Candida infections were seen in 1988. Daptomycin, introduced in 2003. Daptomycin-resistant, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, 2004. So now we have a multi-drug resistant strain that showed up within a year. So what drug companies see when they see this is, what is the point of producing new antibiotics if I'm not going to be able to sell them? Because now we have these drug-resistant bacterial or fungal infections. Why would I spend hundreds of millions of dollars in research and development, spend years trying to get FDA approval, when we may even see resistance before FDA approval is granted? On the previous slide, we saw that resistance can develop even before a drug is FDA approved. How quickly, though, can a microorganism, in this case a bacterium, actually develop antibiotic resistance? How quickly does that antibiotic basically become ineffective? This video is produced by another lab, and what they've set up is a giant petri dish. In each of these bands, they plated some E. coli. E. coli is a very common laboratory bacterium, and here there are no antibiotics. As we start to move to the center, so we'll move into this band here, there is just enough antibiotic to kill the bacterium, and that's why we see no growth, because the antibiotic is there. As we move further in, there's now 10 times the amount of antibiotics that should kill the bacterium, 100 times the amount of antibiotics that should kill, and 1,000 times. So let's see what happens. These E. coli are just left alone. All they're doing is growing and replicating. What happens when we expose them to the antibiotics, when they hit these barriers? We can very quickly start to see, well, over here we have antibiotics that are no longer working. The bacteria are able to grow at the level that should have killed them. And then they stop for a minute, and now they're growing in 10 times the level that should have killed them, on both sides, 10 times. They hit the wall, and then they start to spread again. This is 100 times the level of antibiotic that should have killed them. And then they hit a wall, and now they grow again. And this is 1,000 times the level of antibiotic that should have killed them. This took 11 days. So in 11 days, these bacteria were able to evolve to grow and replicate in 1,000 times the level of antibiotic that should have killed them. This is what's happening in our bodies when we take antibiotics and we don't follow physician instructions. Alexander Fleming won the Nobel Prize for the characterization and discovery of penicillin, the very first antibiotic marketed in the United States. In his Nobel Prize speech, he talked about antibiotic resistance and said that it's the fault of the physicians and the patients for not using antibiotics appropriately. If you use penicillin, use enough. Antibiotics don't work against a cold. Antibiotics don't work against any viral infection. Antibiotics should only be taken if you have a bacterial infection that you are unable to clear. Anything else is inappropriate use of antibiotics. You should never take anybody else's antibiotics. You should never buy antibiotics that are not prescribed to you, and you should always finish your course of antibiotics, because you could end up in a situation like this. I know it's a cartoon, but this is what happens. You hold on, Johnson. The human didn't take the full course of antibiotics. You're going to make it, and we shall rise again. And they do. The director of the World Health Organization said that we're approaching a post-antibiotic era, which basically means the end of modern medicine as we know it. Things like a common strep throat or a child's scratched knee could once again kill. A few years ago, this is what she said: we are approaching the post-antibiotic era. But now it appears that the post-antibiotic era is actually here. In the US, one person dies every 15 minutes because of drug resistance. In my lab, we study a handful of bacteria that the CDC has labeled urgent and serious levels of concern. Combined in the US, the 3 bacteria we study cause over 500,000 infections, 23,000 deaths, and have healthcare and associated costs of upwards of $3.8 billion. What are we trying to do then in my lab to address this issue? One of the first things we're trying to do is actually in conjunction with our majors microbiology lab. We are running this course as what we call a CURE, a course-based undergraduate research experience. In this lab, the students are choosing their own soil sample, isolating bacteria from that soil, and then testing bacteria for the production of antimicrobial compounds. Antibiotics are produced by microorganisms as a type of competitive mechanism. We have been able to take advantage of that to try to fight microbes. So one of the best places to look for new antibiotics is with new microorganisms, and we can often find those in the soil. In this image, students have chosen a bacterial isolate that's streaked here. It's a little bit hard to see, but they streaked it at this spot right here. And you see this clearing area where none of this yellow bacterium has grown. This is because the bacterium that they streaked right here was able to produce a compound that prevented the growth of these microorganisms. I've already told you that antibiotics are not going to be what we can rely on for an extended period of time in the future because of the evolution of antibiotic resistance. But if we can discover new drugs, we can try to stay at least one step ahead of our microbial foes. In my lab, we're also working on identifying genes that are mutated in response to antibiotic treatment. This is how organisms evolve. There's a change to the DNA. So how are these bacteria evolving antibiotic resistance? Our students are growing the bacteria in the lab, exposing them to antibiotics, and once they show resistance, we are sequencing the DNA and looking for the genes that change. Just like in the video I showed you previously, we see the development of resistance within a couple of days at low levels and at high levels of resistance in under 2 weeks. We're also looking into everybody's favorite V word in the time of COVID, vaccines. If we can't treat the infection, why don't we try to prevent it? And so in this situation, what we've done in the lab is created what we call mutant bacteria. And this is not like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles where they gain superpowers. The idea behind making these mutants is to make the bacteria weaker. And if they're weaker, our immune system can fight them off. And if our immune system can fight them off, it can remember when it sees a stronger one next time and it's learned how to fight. So we have made mutants and we test them in, it's called a wax moth larval model. So it looks like little caterpillars. The normal bacterium that is not a mutant kills all of the larvae within about 36 hours. But our mutant, most of the larvae, 90%, survive. These types of mutants are really great candidates for developing vaccines. Finally, I have students who are interested in the synergistic effects. What happens when we combine antibiotics? If antibiotic A works really well, antibiotic B works really well, with a synergistic effect, we see that they actually work better than just A and B combined. So they have an increased efficacy, an increased efficiency when we combine these antibiotics. So we are looking into that because increased efficacy and increased efficiency of clearing infections means less chances to develop resistance. So all that said, the type of work going on in my lab and in hundreds or thousands of labs around the world means that, maybe you can be a little bit more hopeful. Maybe you really don't need to worry after all. Or do you? A student who recently graduated from my lab did a project testing probiotics, those compounds that everybody says are supposed to improve everything about your life. They're beneficial bacteria. And what he found is that commercially available probiotics, including those you can get at places like Walmart, Whole Foods, Target, contain a good amount of antibiotic resistance. That said, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I do promise that if you invite me to your Halloween party, I will not dress up like a course of unfinished antibiotics.